Hello and welcome to our last webcast in our webcast series Sustainability Watch for this year, but rest assured we will continue on every third Thursday of the week of the month in 2020 as well. So if you're interested, please subscribe to the whole series and we will keep you informed about the things that are coming. I'm Uwe Schulte, the moderator. I am the leader of the Sustainability Center of the Conference Board. Today we will talk about China's waste import ban and what happened since and what is next for business. But before we get started, I would like to make a few logistics remarks to enable a good interaction with you, the audience. First of all, at any point in time, please feel free to ask questions. We will answer them as the flow of the conversation allows. In order to do so, you should type them into the bottom left corner of your screen, and we will then take care of them. If you want to download the presentation, you see in the middle of the screen at the bottom, in the middle of the screen, you see the download file, and feel free to do so. If at any point in time you feel that you want to see more of the slide, you can use on the top these 4 arrows and get the presentation in full screen mode. And if you want to return, you just click on it again. If you like the webcast and you think colleagues can profit from listening and watching it, then feel free to share the link with them. The webcast will be available from tomorrow as a streaming download. So that's so much for that. You can earn CPE credits. You have to provide your full name and email address in the space provided. And then during the webcast, you will have 3 pop-ups, which you have to confirm by clicking on them. And that will give you the credits. This will be until the end of this webcast. Please understand that this will be only available during the live webcast, and that feature isn't when you watch the downloaded version. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I must say we are having a huge endeavor today because we are spanning the globe. We have Anke Schrader. She is our senior researcher in the China Center, and she leads the Conference Board research and also the broader Asia region. Her personal research focus is on corporate citizenship and sustainability. Anke has lived and worked in China for over 15 years and is the author of numerous publications on China's social and environmental development agenda, civil society, environment, and their impact on company practices. And she is up at a very late time in China, so I really appreciate that. Hello and welcome, Anke.
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much. And now we span the whole globe and go on the other side. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Susan Robinson, who leads the sustainability team at Waste Management. In this role, she is responsible for sustainability policy, advocacy, and reporting. In her 30-plus years in the industry, she worked in the public sector in non-profit environmental work, consultancy, and over 25 years in the private sector. Susan's experience includes global commodity marketing, research and analysis of industry trends, and 20 years managing municipal solid waste and recycling contracts. Susan is active on several boards, including the American Institute for Packaging and Environment, AmeriPen, the Paper Stock Industries, PSI, and the Southeast Recycling Development Council. Susan attended Stanford University and holds a Bachelor of Science in Applied Earth Science from the University of Washington. Her master's work in environmental studies is from the Evergreen State College. So much, we are so pleased to have you, Susan, and for you, it is very early in the day, and we appreciate that you got up for us so early.
Thank you very much, and good morning from the west coast of the U.S.
Thank you so much. Okay, before we really get started, let me just honor the fact that the Sustainability Center of the Conference Board is actually running this webcast series, Sustainability Watch. And Our purpose in the center is to support member companies to create long-term value and positive impact through sustainability integration into business practices, into business strategy, and into the processes of the organization. And we want to provide timely, thought-provoking, and relevant research. So if you're interested, go on our website and get in contact with us, and we will be happy to interact with you. So let's get started. And Anke, I understand that you have looked into the effects of the China's import ban, and after 2 years, the dust has somewhat settled. But under your leadership and with the support of the Sustainability Center, you have done research on what the longer-term business consequences are. Can you enlighten us a bit about that, please?
Yes, Uwe. Let me just walk you quickly through some of the highlights of the research that we did. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to outline some of the important trends that we've seen in the data since the ban came into effect. And then I think we will have Susan diving into some of the details of what the implications are on the ground for businesses. So for many years, China was really for more than a decade, China was the main final recipient of global waste plastic trade. China imported at some point in time nearly 70% of all plastic waste that was traded globally. At some point in time, around 2013, China started for the first time to introduce more serious import restrictions. This was an operation that was called Green Fence. It was, you could call it a first trial of how import restrictions, how the market would react to import restrictions. And then starting in 2016, China implemented much more serious restrictions that were then, over the course of the next year and a half, were rolled out to include first pre-consumer waste and then later post-consumer waste. And you can see on these charts that we have here on the slide the massive impact that had on global trade. So you can really see the fall off in imports for China and the fall off in global trade here happening between the beginning of 2017 and then all the way, to early 18. And at that point in time, China had really reduced its waste plastic imports to almost zero. So this is just kind of to lay the foundation to what happened, what were some of the key trends on a global scale. Now, what happened next, obviously, was that countries that were very dependent on exports, they were struggling to find new export destinations. And we can see this in the data when we look at trade patterns for other countries, mostly in the emerging Asian markets. So we can see that other countries were starting to pick up some of the trade that China had abandoned. So we see here, for example, Malaysia picking up a significant share, Thailand, Vietnam. So here at the beginning of 2017, there were some very significant increases. Some countries really had a multifold increase in imports from the previous years. What we also see, what is interesting, towards the end of 2018, and the trade data isn't really out yet for 2019, so unfortunately I can't show more recent data, but what we can already see here towards the end of 2018 is that the import for most of these countries is dropping off significantly. And that's very important because we can tell already that there's resistance here to keeping these import levels at these elevated levels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in terms of what kind of regulations have been passed in those countries. So overall, what we can tell from the data up until now is that there was a significant shift to change the location of waste trade that was exported from one country and then imported into another. But we also see that trade fairly quickly leveled off again. Now, if we look at overall trade levels, and this is an analysis here that you can see that is year on year looking at a quarterly basis. So you can really tell that in 2018 we had a consistent, a permanent reduced level of global waste trade. And this is really entering a new era, I think, that will be permanent. It's unlikely that trade levels will recover to the levels that we saw before China imposed these restrictions. So this is kind of a new world scenario that companies and economies will have to deal with. When we talk about different economies and their recycling capabilities and their export dependencies, we see obviously a huge variety. So depending on the country and its infrastructure, recycling capabilities can vary very significantly. I've just picked a couple examples here that we looked at in the study. We've picked the US, we've picked Germany and Japan. All of these markets are very different in terms of their infrastructure when it comes to recycling, plastic recycling. And you can see here, for example, for the US, in terms of all plastic trash that is collected, 15% of that gets recycled. Now, if we look at the next level of that, how much of that collected trash that is supposed to be recycled, how much of that is exported? So for the US, that number, this is 2016 data. Obviously, this is before the ban, because we're looking at the impact that the ban had, that the Chinese ban had. So in 2016, 95% of this collected trash that was going to recycling was exported. Now, if we look at the next level and we look at, okay, how much of these exports, what's the share of the exports going to China? We see again that the share is very, very high. For the US, it's over 70%. So you can tell here the dependence the US had on Chinese markets was very, very significant. So what are some of these implications? What does all of this mean in terms of where business is headed? Where are markets headed? What's the implication for businesses that are working on the ground in the markets, but also are obviously were dependent on global trade patterns before? One of the things that we are observing very clearly is that we're seeing more and more policy interventions, both at the global levels, but also at regional and local levels. I've talked about this on an earlier slide just now. About regulations that are either being already implemented or being contemplated on the ground in new waste export destinations. So these are countries, for example, like India or Malaysia and Thailand. All of these countries have absorbed a very significant share of waste that was previously destined to China. And in all of these countries, we're seeing a lot of opposition. In India, for example, import bans were already coming into effect later this year. In other countries like Malaysia and Thailand, in Indonesia and Vietnam, we're seeing import restrictions either being discussed or being enacted at a later point over the next couple of years.
Anke, can you just
Yes?
explain a little bit the background of the Bazel Convention, or Basel Convention, I should rather say?
Yeah, so so obviously one of the most important policy change that came out of the ban was the amendments to the Bazel Convention. The Bazel Convention governs the exports of hazardous waste and its disposal. It's not only limited to plastic, but what really changed, so what the difference with the new amendment now means is that it's now also covering mixed, unrecyclable, and contaminated plastics that are destined for export. So there's been a significant shift in what the Bazel Convention covers and therefore what can be legally traded and what cannot, and what the restrictions are for global trade. So this has a significant impact on obviously on a country that is very export dependent, for example, a country like the US, and it obviously has huge implications for recyclers and exporters that are working in those industries. Now, another interesting trend that we're seeing is how China itself is dealing with plastic recycling. China itself has a really ambitious plan to upgrade its own industry. There have been two very important regulations that have been drafted this year, or that are in discussions this year, and that are going to be completed at some point in the future. One is concerned with pollution control of plastics. The other one is a three-year strategy that looks at recycling and waste plastic utilization. And so the fact that these two policy papers are currently in draft is really an indication also that the industry is going to be much more regulated, that China is going to have a lot of investments in this area. The shift that China really wants to see going forward over the next decades, obviously this is a long-term plan. There's going to be serious investments needed. There will be a lot of oversight needed on the ground for implementation. But the bigger strategy here, the long-term strategy, is to really move away from landfill, which is already saturated in China, move away from landfill incineration and move more aggressively into recycling. There's also been a very strong shift away from small-scale workshops, which are still very dominant in China, small-scale recycling workshops, to really upgrade those into industrial park clusters that work across value chains. Big data is going to play a big role here in creating information infrastructure across value chains also. And the fourth pillar in this overarching plan is really innovation and development around recycling technology. This is obviously not something that is unique to China. No matter where you are located, if it's in the West or if it's in countries that are now receiving a larger share of the waste plastic than before, product lifecycle innovation will be critical. And there are a couple of levers that I think from a company point of view will be particularly important. Obviously, one is the use of substitute materials and the development of these materials and bringing them up to scale. A second lever, and of course there's already companies already extremely engaged on this, is cutting down on single-use plastic. This is obviously one of the issues that is really in the public eye. And so companies are increasingly pressured to take significant action on this issue. There's also a lot of legislation in the works. Some already passed, some is still in process, that is banning single-use plastic items. So this is an area obviously that's already where companies are already forced to take action. Growing recycling markets, bringing recycling markets up to scale is obviously another big area. One of the key takeaways of China's ban, I think, really is that it has highlighted the flaws of current waste trade economics. And as we acknowledge that, and I think Susan will talk about this later in more detail, what these flaws are, what the result now is after the ban, and how we have, some of the scenarios, how we can overcome that. There's going to have to be a serious reckoning in the industry on how to make the industry profitable and scalable. And then finally, one big area also that will be very important for companies is the replacement of conventional packaging materials. This is also an area that is going to be extremely important in China, where delivery services play a huge role in waste generation, and the regulation of that going forward and engagement of companies in this space will be very important. And I'm going to close just with a comment on what else companies can do, should be doing, are already doing. One of the spaces that is very interesting to watch now is how companies are trying to collaborate really across all value chains to come together and try to solve this issue. Over the last few years, we have seen a number of alliances, industry company alliances, often in partnership with nonprofits, have seen these alliances emerge and trying to work together on this problem, I think, on an unprecedented scale. And one example is the Global Commitment Initiative that is initiated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And here companies have come together around the goal to reduce, to increase the recycled content in plastic packaging. And these are just an example of the targets that have been set here by companies like Coke and Pepsi, Nestle and Danone. And you can see these aspirations here are quite significant in terms of where companies are now, which are the blue bars, and where companies need to be in terms of the targets that they have set themselves for 2025 and 2030. What all of these initiatives have in common is really a commitment to shared targets, to create these shared targets, provide progress reports. There's a lot of initiative around collective investments, identifying one issue that companies rally around and then pour money into it. That's another area, how these collaborations work. And then really value chain collaboration. So partners that usually wouldn't work closely together really come together across the value chain to tackle one specific issue.
Thank you so much, Anke. This is really enlightening to better understand the consequences of the ban. I must say the report, of course, contains a lot more information and goes into quite some depth. And if the audience would like to have access to the report, it's easily available for members of the conference board. But if you're not a member of the conference board, get in contact with me, and I will make sure that you get access to a copy. Now, before we go on, I would like to remind the audience that you can use the bottom left corner box to raise questions. Christopher has already used the box to show us an initiative and an organization that is very committed in this field. But please ask questions to our experts if you would like to know more or better understand the whole thing. Before we go on to Susan, Anke, I would like to ask you a question about, if I understood correctly, when you talked about the initiatives in China, that is not only that state-owned companies in China will engage in this. These are opportunities for businesses, global businesses, to get engaged in these initiatives in China, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The recycling sector in China is mostly private. To a large extent, that sector is in the hands of private companies. There's definitely going to be a huge opportunity to engage on this issue for foreign companies and local companies. The question is really more in terms of implementation, in terms of time scale, and enforcement on the ground. So this is always an issue in China. The rollout of big strategies, of big campaigns is one thing, but then the actual implementation and how smoothly it's going to go and what some of the roadblocks will be are a little bit hard to foresee. In China right now, what we have seen in direct response to the ban is a significant increase in the import of virgin plastic material. So this is obviously not the desired effect that we want to see. How long-term this will be is really hard to say. For example, some of the complexities around the issue in terms of how successful investments will really be and how successful China will really be at upgrading its recycling industry will be around these competing interests between recycling and virgin industry. So, for example, for the virgin industry, the state-owned sector is very much involved in there. There are a couple of very large state-owned players that dominate that space, and obviously there's going to be friction there. So that's going to be those are going to be the areas that companies will need to assess if they are moving into the space, to kind of look at what their strategy is, what are realistic scenarios for investment, and what potential outcomes could be.
Very clear. Thank you so much. And you have painted a picture now of a very drastic change in global trade of waste. And I think let's move on to Susan now. Susan, Waste Management, your company, is experiencing these drastic changes firsthand. And can you talk a little bit about what this has meant for waste management?
Yes, thank you so much. And I think Anke set the stage very well to really start to then drill down into what is the impact of these global changes that China's really set off in terms of a kind of a whole series of events. And what does that then mean to recyclers across the globe? So I start first with a brief overview of waste management. For those who aren't familiar with the company, we are the largest recycler in North America. We manage about 15 million tons of material each year, recyclables each year. That's through about 103 recycling facilities. So we'll probably make up about 25 to 30% of the processing in the United States. Vast majority of that is paper, but also other materials as well, which I will talk about as we move forward through this slide deck. So with that global change in markets that really was started in China, what really has that meant for recyclers across the globe, really? So China consumed more than 50% of the world's mixed paper and mixed recyclables. And I want to start out by highlighting, we have a large dialogue happening globally right now around plastics, but the ban that China set forth 2.5 years ago was a ban on imports of mixed paper and mixed plastic. By far, the tonnage impact has been paper. Plastic makes up a fairly small portion of the overall number of tons that are collected for recycling, and the market impact to recycling across the globe with the paper ban has really been significant. The movement of material we have now 50% of the tons that used to go to China from the world, from every continent in the world, are now looking for a different home. And so it's created an oversupply situation for recyclables across the globe. They had started out with a series of a ban that was announced. And then they also added to that a quality requirement of a 0.5% contamination limit, which is virtually impossible to do. That's almost zero recyclable contamination content. And then they've added to that, and this is really where we see the actual implications today, limiting their their amount of imports that they allow. They have quotas every year that they issue, and fundamentally what they've been able to do is cut off the imports by not issuing quotas for companies and to be able to move material into China. So we'll talk about what that looks like in terms of the drop off of tons, but it's really had significant implications across the globe. And they announced that by 2021, they would completely eliminate imports into China of all materials, of recycled materials. I think the recycling industry did not initially take that seriously. That's a very significant statement for a country that relied on imports to produce packaging and products that they then shipped and exported. However, in fact, we are seeing that the tonnage and the banned imports are moving into effect. So just to highlight what that looks like, on the upper left, you'll see the change in paper exports to China from the U.S., and the U.S. was a significant exporter of material into China, starting in November of 2017, and the first day of January was when that ban of 2018, when that ban took place. When that ban actually was announced and took place, and you can see the dramatic impact of the lack of mixed paper moving into China. And then on the lower left, you can see the changes of percentages of all sorts of different plastics that were being exported from the US. It's just been a massive shift of material. And on the right, you can see that dramatic drop off. It's a small chart, but it's a dramatic drop off of US plastic exports to China. Before I move on, I'd like to point out on the upper right, this is a slide that gives a sense of the materials that we process through our recycling facilities. So this generally is the residential recyclables that are collected and managed through the systems in the United States. And what's so important about this, you'll notice that about 60% of the recyclables are paper, and about 4.5% are plastic. So really the challenge for recyclers has been, and we keep collecting that material regardless of what the end markets are, and the challenge has been really managing the volumes of paper that we're collecting with this massive shift in markets. So how have all these changes impacted recyclers? Let's start with just this global map, and these are waste management tons that we collect in the U.S. and where they are and where we sell them, and it shows the change from 2017 through 2019, basically. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we learned was that we are the 7th largest exporter of all goods by volume from the United States. That counts everything from trees to agricultural goods to computers to anything. And it's because of the weight and the volume. And we were basically to China a backhaul. So we would buy goods from China, and those goods would come over in shipping containers, and then our product was a cheap backhaul. We provided basically ballast for those ships moving back to China. They would use our products to make the packaging and products, our recyclables, to make the packaging and products that then they sold back to us or throughout the globe. So we had shipping patterns that were established. We had a really economically strong relationship. It was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship for many years with our primarily paper as well as plastic moving to and from China. So with the ban, that shipping disruption was significant, and we really had to look for new markets for all of our material. Waste management, I think, is a good indicator of, because we do so much business, a good indicator of what was happening in the US, and we needed to find other markets. So we've become much more diverse in where we sell material. We relied on India quite heavily for the first year or so, and now what we're seeing is a growth of demand in North America. So some mills have begun to add capacity. This is for paper as well as for plastic, and we are able to keep more of our material in the US. We actually earlier this year announced that we would not export any of our residential plastics, so we are moving all of our material to North American markets, we've gone from domestically shipping about, we used to sell 3 years ago, about 63% of all of our recyclables went to domestic markets, leaving 37% to be exported. Now we sell almost 80% to North America. Actually, it's 80% to North American markets and only export about 20%, and that is virtually all paper and some high quality film plastic as well.
Susan, can I, before you go on, two things that strike me when I see your chart. One is first of all, the majority of what you're showing here is actually paper and not plastic. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And the second thing is, I think a lot of people have the perception, oh God, people have used these shipping lanes to ship waste away, and that's not only sort of bad in one sense, but it's also extra transport. But basically, that transport was happening either with empty ships or with filled ships. Is that also correct?
That is correct. Yes. Yes. And so now what we find is when we're shipping recyclables to other countries, the shipping lanes are not the ones that have been established over the years. And so it's increased the cost of shipping and the time of shipping, because you're not shipping to the same countries that had that same robust production and export as well. So it's really changed that entire dynamic of the transportation system.
Before we go on, Christopher has asked a question. I'm not quite sure whether I fully understand it, but I'm sure you do. Can't people reuse BPA-free plastic by utilizing past practices like the milk delivery man? Where I live in New York State, there is a new program called Loop that Governor Andrew Cuomo is promoting.
Yes, Loop is a great program. So it basically is when you buy certain products, a certain number of companies have come together to offer reusable containers for basic goods and products, from ice cream to milk to other household items. You pay a premium for basically putting a deposit on those containers. It's very expensive. Most people would not choose to pay the cost of that initial deposit, which is a challenge that we know needs to be overcome. But it keeps material in the system being reused over and over. So I think that's a great example of the attention. This has really highlighted the need to think differently about packaging, and I think that's a great example of a company that is collaborating with other companies to provide a service to really reduce that packaging.
Thanks, Susan. Please go on.
Sure. Okay, great. So the second thing, in addition to kind of this disruption in movement of material, is because we now have this oversupply without the demand for material, and at the same time, there's been a softening of China's economy. You just have a lot more material that's collected that hasn't had a home. And when that happens, there are a couple things. One, the quality requirements are very high, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the reduced demands impacts the pricing. So as you can see here, beginning in 2017, a pretty steady drop off of the value of we call it a blended value of all the materials that we handle at our facility. What's really interesting about this is that decline is primarily because of paper. Plastic has actually stayed quite stable through this process in terms of the value of PET and HDPE, but paper has been in a steady decline. Cardboard pricing, which has increased as a percentage of the material that we handle with the increase of e-commerce, is at the lowest price it's ever been that we're aware of, at least for decades, and that has really created a challenge as we are now looking at pricing that has gone from as high as over $120 a ton US to $36 a ton in November on average. And that places a big challenge to the recycling community, both cities as well as recyclers. So I will see if I can make some sense out of this. If you look at the box on the right, you'll see the revenue coming from commodity sales in 2017 was $120 a ton. Now this is actually a little outdated. It's let's just roughly say $38 a ton. And so it's dropped by $82 a ton. But our cost to process has gone up. As I mentioned before, the quality requirements by our end markets are higher than they've ever been, set off by China's 0.5% expectation for quality contamination. The rest of the world kind of said, oh, wait, let's also increase our requirements for quality. And we have an oversupply, so we can be very picky about what we take for recycling recycling. So we've had to put more cost into our recycling facilities to clean up that material. So while the revenue has gone down by $82 a ton, our costs have gone up in order to be able to clean up that material. So as you can see, recycling facilities are seeing a dramatic loss of profit. Of their cost exceeds the revenue that we're taking in, and that impacts our customers. Certainly, we have cities that are really struggling to understand how they can afford their recycling programs, and many of our other customers as well. And in the meantime, as I mentioned, for a residential program, there is no relationship between end markets and the material we collect. We keep collecting it every single day, and so we are really having to continue to move that material even when it is at a loss.
But Susan, when I see these numbers, what strikes me is in the past, people have used the, let's say, excuse to say, I can't use recycled material because it's actually more expensive to use it and it's not the same quality as virgin. So actually, I really have to use virgin. Now, with this drop in price, there must be a huge incentive to use that material to a larger extent.
And in fact, in the US, there are 17 mills that have announced expansions or new mills, paper mills, just for that reason. Again, plastic is a little bit different story. It is based much more on the virgin capacity, and there is so much new virgin capacity on the market in the US, for polyethylene in particular, that we do see that is a challenge for recycled content. The goals that companies have set, as Anka talked about before, are very important for driving that post-consumer content through the system, because the virgin prices are so low. Indeed, it is often cheaper to use virgin plastic than it is post-consumer. But for paper, that's not the case. For paper, which is, again, the vast majority of the volume of material we collect, about 60% of what we recycle is paper in our residential programs and more overall. That you're exactly right. The mills are able to get that paper right now at a very low to zero price.
Is that good news for rainforests and other places in terms of that we will see a drop in virgin paper?
Well, I guess I would say in the U.S. we are seeing a big investment in demand for post-consumer paper. We expect to see over the next 2 years more demand, which hopefully will help stabilize the market. But you have in other places, I think in South America, you have a lot of virgin paper still being used, and so I do think it is very geographically specific. I think in China it'll be interesting to see if you see more post-consumer or if you see more fast-growing fiber that can be used as a virgin fiber instead of post-consumer. So I think the jury's probably still out as to some of the overall impacts, and it very well could be geographically specific and not look the same in the US or in Europe as it does in South America or China.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what does this mean for the future? I think, we are certainly seeing a significant overhauling of our industry, a real big business change in what's happening. So I have been in the recycling business for over 30 years, and we like to say recycling is a religion, recycle or die, in the Seattle, Washington community. I think this has really forced recyclers to reevaluate why we recycle. We have really used it as an excuse, I think, or as a way to feel better about purchasing things. We've used it as a diversionary tactic to, we're not going to throw it away. We feel good about recycling and putting it in the recycling container. I think the point you made a little bit ago is, it's can we get recyclables cheaper as a feedstock? And that certainly isn't always the case. And we also are finding, it is really not the solution for marine debris, and it is certainly not free. There is cost that goes into it. And we have established our recycling programs really primarily on these basic premises. So what we are doing now is understanding recycling as a commodity business. It's driven by market demand, and it needs high quality material if it's going to move in the system. And I think importantly too, we've had to step back and ask ourselves what we were recycling and why we were recycling and how we were recycling. And really, we've said, we recognize now that recycling isn't the goal. Environmental impact, reducing environmental impacts are the goal. So we need to be a little bit more holistic in how we look at what we are recycling, so that we're ensuring that we are having a net environmental impact. So what this has really done for us is it's pushed that focus on end markets. In the US, there was a lot of focus on getting people to put material in their recycling cart. We did that pretty well, but we also started to get a lot of things we didn't want in the recycling cart. And as that quality requirement started to really constrict, we really needed to step back and understand that what goes in the cart needs to be the same material that has an end market demand. If we push something through the system that can't get recycled into a new product, we have added up extra cost, significant amount of extra cost, and environmental burden for something that is going to end up potentially in a landfill or waste to energy. So it's allowed for a conversation with our customers to be able to make sure that we are only recycling those things that do have an end market, and that we can process an economic and environmental benefit. So just to wrap up, I think there's some really good dialogue that takes place. I say when things are good, it's easy to kind of keep doing the same thing. But when things are tough, you really are forced to get better at what you do. And I would say that we are making our system so much better right now because we are challenged and we are having to fine-tune our operations, working with our customers, educating our customers on how to recycle right, improving our systems. Waste management and other recyclers in the US are making investments in technologies to be able to recycle more efficiently. We are in our third year of investing, just entering our third year of investing over $100 million a year in new recycling facilities and new technologies. That's more than we've invested in years and years. And so we're really recognizing the need to be more efficient and make those investments. We're building a new facility in Chicago, Illinois, which will be our new kind of state-of-the-art recycling facility that will be able to be more flexible as the waste stream changes and manage material more efficiently. We're moving material to market. We've made policy decisions that we will continue to find markets for our material, even if we have to pay to do so. We have some cases, mixed waste paper and glass, for example, where it costs us money to move that material to market, but we have made the decision to continue to do that. We have made a policy decision to not export plastics, residential plastics. We are finding markets in North America for that material, and we are seeing demand start to develop, so that's pretty exciting as well. And then to wrap up, policy changes, certainly we are seeing bills and legislation in states across the US that are banning certain types of materials and really driving change in the types of materials being collected for recycling. And we're establishing new financial relationships around recycling that will make it much more sustainable in the future, ensuring that recyclers are being paid to provide the collection and the processing services, and then that commodity value has the opportunity to be shared with our customers after those costs are incurred. So it's a much more sustainable model that helps our customers understand the relationship of recycling in their communities. And I think what's important, if you read news articles about communities stopping their programs, ending their recycling programs due to costs, about a month ago, a group of entities across the United States did a scan to look to see what was happening in communities across the country. And indeed, out of 20,000 communities in the United States, only 60 had have chosen to end their recycling programs. And of those 60, 2/3 of those are very small rural type communities that probably were on the edge economically anyway. So we're finding that citizens want to recycle. They're telling their elected officials that they want to recycle, who are then making decisions on how to keep those recycling programs. So those are some positive things that are really coming out of this challenge, and we see them helping to create a sustainable program in the future.
Thank you, Susan, so much. This was really very interesting to understand what the consequences have done to the recycling business in the example of the US and especially of waste management. And I'm impressed that despite the challenges, you're going to continue to have all your efforts continuing. I would like to come back for a moment to Anke and ask a question based on that insight. You know, what I'm seeing, Anke, is that there will be a need to invest in infrastructure and capacity and all of that. And what we've seen from China is that they are quite aggressive in the sense of making investments where they see future markets. We've seen this with solar panels, for example, and they've really taken the global lead. Do you think China will use their efforts to improve recycling in China to also export that know-how? What do you think?
This could certainly be an opportunity in the long run. To a certain extent, this is already happening on a smaller scale. So we do see some of the recyclers who were previously onshore in China now relocating to other countries, for example, in the US. And what is happening there is that they are building facilities that are essentially doing the business that they used to do in China, for example, converting recyclables into pellets and then exporting those pellets from the US into China. So this is one aspect on a relatively small scale for now that is already happening. Obviously, on a grander scale and in the very long term, we could perceive I can imagine that once the recycling industry itself in China is substantial and is up to scale, that we could see some similar demand dynamics as you mentioned in the solar industry, where China is becoming a significant global player. We do have to look at it realistically, though, on the ground, and this is where I think when companies do go in and are thinking about investing, that they're going to have to track very carefully what the realistic scenarios are. China is at its very early stage right now with recycling programs. Shanghai has just started to introduce household recycling and trying to enforce it. There are fines, for example, now in place in Shanghai for people who don't recycle properly, household recycling, that is. There are other cities that are going to follow suit. Beijing will start household recycling schemes, mandatory household recycling schemes next year. So all of this is coming. But as with anything on that scale in a country that isn't used to it, it's messy, it's often inefficient. So it's really something that we're going to have to observe over the longer term. There isn't going to be a significant breakthrough next year. That's for sure.
Thank you, Anke. Susan, do you reckon that there might be some competition going on in the US from Chinese investors?
We are seeing, as Anke said, some Chinese companies have purchased mills in the US for paper in particular, and are shipping with the intent to ship pulp back to China, which is not banned. So again, to do that work, the kind of the dirtier work here in the US, and then ship the pulp product that they need now still in China into the country to be able to manufacture new products. So it's a topic that is very interesting, and folks are really watching carefully, trying to understand. We have a lot of mill groups that we've worked with from China. Some have established mills in countries around the edges of Vietnam, for example, and so material is moving there, and we definitely are seeing more investment in the US, and I think the jury's out as to what that's going to look like over time. There's a real, I think, uncertainty as to the policies that China will continue to drive and what material will be allowed to move into the country. So I think there's a little bit of caution about how much investment will result in material moving back into China.
Thank you very much. I think we'll watch that space. But let me before I ask you the final question, where you see things going, let me summarize what I heard, and please challenge what I heard. Fundamentally, the ban that started in China was putting an end to something that was really convenient for every participant, but didn't actually address the root issue of recycling, and it was a simple way of getting rid of material. And when China came up with the ban, the first reaction was, let's move it somewhere else. And I think what we're now seeing is that people are really rethinking the supply chain of waste. And it's interesting that you say it's like any other commodity, you really have to manage supply and demand and make sure that the quality is right. So it looks to me as if we're really getting into a new stage of waste, excuse the pun, Susan, of waste management. And that is, on the one hand, very interesting and encouraging, but on the other hand, we have to be really clear about that this is a very complex, time and capital investment intensive process. So possibly consumer expectations and the possibility to come up with solutions might have a time gap.
So, I think that's a fair statement. Yes.
Okay, so, Susan, where do you see the next step? I feel that we have to go across borders of company boundaries and really look for this collaboration more, so that, for example, companies who design packaging have to better understand what the requirements of a recycler are. For example, I hear this carbon black problem where recycling units, optical units, don't see the product, and things need to be changing by design, for example. Would that be something you see as well, more collaboration in the future?
There are a lot of efforts around the design, around packaging, and we actually are working closely with companies to help them understand what we, from our perspective, how to design packaging to be recyclable and what the markets are looking for. I think the next piece of it is we need to ensure that we are actually using products and buying products that are and made products that are made with post-consumer content. And that's if you think about it, that's really the challenge. Is we have purchased a lot of our products in other countries, and so the material needs to ultimately end up as the feedstock for a product that's being made somewhere and purchased somewhere. So I think finding the boundaries, as you say, the political boundaries and where that material is going to move, it plays an important role, along with just making sure fundamentally that those materials can be recycled.
Excellent, thank you. And Anke, just a question, a brief outlook. How fast do you think that transformation of recycling in China is going to happen?
Well, that's a really difficult one. I don't have a looking glass, so it's very hard to say. I do believe that the policies indicate that this change is for real, that we'll see very serious, significant investments over the next coming years, that there's a lot of opportunity for the private sector to engage on it. But I see the biggest challenge in the local implementations and the local enforcement of some of these policies that are being rolled out. I think another challenge that we will see, and where companies have a very big role to play actually, is in consumer education. Getting the consumer on board here, seeing that we're at very early stages here of recycling programs. There's a long history of recycling in many countries in Europe and in the US. This is not the case in China. Sorting has been done mostly here at the back end of things through sorters that take, the waste that's come in a collective form and then sort through it after it's come into the facility. Now we're pushing that here to the household level. and getting consumers to understand the value of that, and also the value of investing into products that utilize recycled materials, whether it be paper or plastic or other materials. This is where companies can really, really play a role. But this is a long-term endeavor. We're talking many, many years.
I understand, but I think even so, you're downplaying the thing in China, but I think that consumer education has to happen everywhere in the world. Thank you both so much. Anke for staying up so late, and Susan for getting up so early. It was really, really insightful what you shared with us. I would like to alert the audience to our upcoming webcast next year. As I said, every third Thursday in the month, we will continue with that webcast series, and I hope you subscribe to it. And feel free to get in contact with us. And if you would like to have access to the report that Anke was referring to, then get also in contact with us, and we will share that with you. Please do the feedback now. It's only a couple of minutes, and it will help us to improve our service to you. Thank you to the audience, and I wish you a really relaxing break if you have this in the next few weeks, and all the best for the start in the new year. Thank you and goodbye.